Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to another episode of Season of AI. Today we have with us the special guest Aditya Oberai. He is the developer advocate as at Appright, and he is a Microsoft MVP, a super cool guy, community enabler, and a dear friend. So he'll be talking about Azure AI, OpenAI, and .NET. So over to you, Aditya.
Thank you so much, Askar sir. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. I am really excited and glad to be up here on the Azure Developer Community channel today. Um, I already had a little introduction, which I think was great. But once again, I'm Aditya. I've been around tech communities, around hackathons, around Azure and .NET, and a lot of other Microsoft tech for the last 5 years or so now. And lately, I've spent a lot more time supporting and enabling open source software in open source communities. And I think for today, considering we are celebrating Season of AI, I'm actually excited to talk about two of my favorite technologies. One, of course, is OpenAI, and another that I've mentioned a little earlier, which is .NET, and seeing how we can bring them together and work with them, which I think is going to be fun for sure. Um, I think a couple of cool things we're going to do here is that we're actually going to look at the recently announced OpenAI SDK for .NET, which was actually just announced at Microsoft Build, very, very recently, in fact, which I think is great for the .NET ecosystem. If you want to build AI-enabled applications without a lot of machine learning knowledge, actually, I think it does democratize access to AI, which I think is good for everyone. So we're going to look at OpenAI as APIs and SDK for .NET, of course. We'll try a couple of things there. We'll try chat generation, we'll try image generation, and we'll do this with a simple console app just to get started with so that even if you don't have a lot of .NET knowledge beforehand, it'll be a good place at least to get a very initial understanding. And we'll actually then take it forward and also see if we can achieve the same things with Azure OpenAI service as well. So I'm not going to have a presentation right now. We'll do a lot more live coding and just the live experience of how you build with these tools and stretch, which I think is going to be interesting and fun for sure. So I am actually going to do one thing and shift StreamYard to the right, just so that we've got my main working environment here with us. And what we'll do then is we're just going to have a new window of, well, my browser first, just to get started with. Now, the first thing, of course, here that's a prerequisite is that you need to have .NET installed, which is a fairly quick job, at least as of now. You can do so from the .NET website. Um, we can get the latest LTS version of the SDK, which is .NET 8. Um, Once we set this up, we'll be good to begin working. I already have it set up on my device, so I'm not going to run through the installation right now, but you can do that. Aside from that, if you have VS Code, that's good enough. We're going to be using the terminal and VS Code for um, this particular project and live stream, which is good enough for what we need to do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first set up a little console application for us, we're going to use for both the OpenAI and the Azure OpenAI service examples. So for that, what I'm going to do here is I am going to create a new console app using the .NET CLI. By the way, once you do install the .NET CLI, you'll be able to see, whichever versions and installed SDKs and runtimes you have, um, which in this case is going to be available through, the commands I have here. So I already have .NET 8 installed for us, which is what I wanted to double check and show, as well as a few other versions of the SDK. But you do not need the older ones. I think just .NET 8 is good enough for this sample. So once that is all sorted out, I'm going to go ahead and create a new console application here for us using the command I have on the screen. And I think what we'll call this is Season of AI. I think that's a good directory name for now, a good project name. Actually, we'll go back to .NET conventions. So once that, once we run that command, it's going to create a console application for us. And .NET actually supports a number of these templates. So if you need APIs, web apps, a number of other kinds of apps, .NET's CLI has the scaffolding available, which you can find in the .NET docs. Um, Either way, I think for now, since we're good to go with this, I'm going to go ahead and I'll open this project up in VS Code, which is going to give me a simple Hello World application. Now, just to make sure that everything is working, if this is the first time you've set up the .NET SDK, what you can do is once you have this open, you can run a command .NET run in your terminal. And if it runs, it's going to print hello world for us, which as you can see, it does. So that's good enough. What your directory structure will then look like is you have the program file, which is the entry program for a .NET application. You have the CS proj, which is a configuration file. So your target .NET um, runtime is going to be mentioned here. Any packages you install later on will be mentioned here, which we will be doing. It's like if you're from the JavaScript world, it's an equivalent of the package.json. We have the solution file here as well, which is effectively a kind of file that Visual Studio IDE uses to load projects. And it's also used by the Solution Explorer if you have the C# dev kit installed in your VS Code um, instance. Then we have the binary, the bin, and the OBJ folders, and these typically contain build files and project assets, which we don't need to worry about too much right now. But yeah, that's the structure of our project. That's what um, a very simple Hello World .NET console application looks like. Now, obviously, in this case, we want to go ahead and we want to try and see how the OpenAI library and SDK works. Now, if anyone is still fairly new to what OpenAI does, I think we've all come across ChatGPT in the past, right? Um, if for example it's going to provide us a very simple chat completions interface, right? That's what ChatGPT does, and lets us ask questions about effectively anything and everything we want. Like for example, if I ask what is .NET, it's going to give us an answer as to what .NET is. And I feel like a lot of tooling like what ChatGPT has right now, the kind of generative AI tooling we have today is actually really, really um, good. It gives us a lot of information, it gives us a lot of knowledge. It may have challenges as to how up to date is it is sometimes, but that's a challenge with the kind of information it's been loaded with. Um, but yeah, I think there is a lot of value to such tools right now. Now, tomorrow, of course, if you want to implement this in an application where you ask a question and it gives an answer, um, we do need to be able to, well, use their API and implement it in an application, right? So that's effectively what we're going to do now. Now, if you haven't done this in the past, what you then do is you go to a website by OpenAI, which is their OpenAI platform web app. Now, this, of course, is available at platform.openai.com, and it gives you access to the documentation for the API, all the facilities that the API offers, and the API reference itself. So it also has quick starts available, the information on the different models that is there, um, as well as samples on all the different functionalities of the OpenAI API right now. So if you want to implement GPT-4s or GPT-4Os facilities within an application, that's going to let you do that. We're going to be testing two applications out of this, by the way. We'll be trying text generation and image generation particularly. So for that, the first thing we need to do, of course, is create an API key. Now, in order to create an API key, you must first have your a project created within the platform application. I already have a few of these ready, but if you don't, it'll either provide you with a default project or you can actually create a project on your own after that. Um, both of those options are valid. Other than that, once that is done, different APIs within, well, OpenAI actually have different pricing tiers you need to enable. So the way that actually works is that um, when we look at the different models, like for example, we look at GPT-4o, to be able to use GPT-4o, you need to hit a certain usage tier. The usage tier for GPT-4 is a little lower. GPT 3.5 has the lowest usage tier, but that effectively means that you need to spend a certain amount of, well, money, or at least, you need to be able to, um, you need to have added a certain number of credits to your account. For GPT-4o, I think that's slightly higher as compared to 3.5. We can actually look into that right now. So if we look for usage tiers, yeah. So at the free tier, you get access to GPT 3.5 and some of the other models like Whisper and Dolly. Um, I am currently at a relatively higher usage tier limit because I have actively been using um, the GPT API for a while now. But if you're just starting off, I think the 3.5 turbo model is good enough to begin with. Tier 1 is where you unlock GPT-4o access. So for that, you need to have spent at least $5, which I think is good enough. I feel like I'm probably on tier 2 right now. But yeah, we can use any of these models here at least for now. So once your usage tier is set, if you want to spend more money, you can do that. You can add a certain number of credits. That's not going to be a problem. And then, of course, we create an API key. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that when we create an API key, what's going to happen then is that you can only copy it when, of course, you create it. And after that, it's not going to be available to copy. So make sure that you save your API key here right now. What I'm going to do then is I'm actually going to go ahead, um, create a new class here for myself. Um, well, actually, I'll tell you what, forget that. We'll just use the environment variables for this. So I'm going to set this in my environment as OpenAI key, and we'll save it within just this particular instance. By the way, this key is something I will be deleting after the session is over. So I don't mind showing it at least in the meantime. But yeah, once that is done, we'll be able to use it as an environment variable. The next thing we want to do here is we want to install the package for C Sharp's OpenAI SDK, the .NET OpenAI SDK. So the way we do that is we're gonna run a command .NET add package OpenAI, and because we're using a very early newly introduced library for this, it is only currently available as a pre-release library. So we're gonna have to add a little tag pre-release here. The moment we do that, it's going to install the .NET SDK for us. And so when we look at our CS file, our configuration file, you're going to see a package reference to this SDK. Now, the moment we do that, what that means is we can now use the OpenAI SDK within our program here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do here is I am actually going to go ahead and create an OpenAI client for us. And what this is going to do is it's this is going to initialize, well, the OpenAI SDK for us so that we can then consume its different facilities and its different APIs in our program. Now, since we already stored our OpenAI key as an environment variable, we can now access it in the program. I'm just going to go ahead and double check exactly how we saved it. So it's called OpenAI key. And with that, we should be able to use the OpenAI API key within our program now. This is normally a good practice when you want to create um, applications and you don't want to disclose your environment variable and your API keys and so on, of course, publicly. Now I know we've got some amount of Copilot completions here. This, however, was based on an older version of how the SDK works. So we're going to actually write this up on our own. The first thing, however, that we need to do here is we need to initialize a chat client. And the reason we must do this is because for each different functionality of the OpenAI SDK, they have a different client that lets you consume its APIs. So you could either just initialize the chat client on its own, or you could use the OpenAI API to initialize a chat client. So when we do this, we can actually initialize a chat client based on the specific model we want to consume. So if, for example, that is GPT-4o, we've just got to add the model string here and we'll be able to consume it. Similarly, if you want to use 3.5 turbo, you could add that, or GPT-4, or any of the other models you've got for chat completion, of course. Now, suppose I actually want to take an input from, you know, a user within our chat window, and we want to ask them. Let's actually create a little code where we can ask someone. We can let the user actually enter the question that they want to ask. Um, so I'm just going to mention, welcome to the OpenAI.NET chatbot. Ask me anything about tech. Well, why not? Let's actually just let it ask a question about tech here, right? And we're going to go ahead. We'll actually read the answer from the console itself. So this way, when we run this application, it's going to use the input mentioned on the command line uh, to let us get an answer. So with this, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a chat completion. And just for context, normally var is good enough when you're using .NET. In this case, however, I noticed that there was some amount of like it's better to mention the exact type that you want to use. The reason I do so is because I did notice some challenges when I was testing out the SDK in the inference of the type, which shouldn't happen, but just to be safe, I am going to mention the type explicitly. So yeah, what we're going to do here is, by the way, we can use the asynchronous version of this API function, we can also use the synchronous version. Both are available. I, by force of habit, will use the async version. So what we then do here is we're just going to mention the input we had, and this should give us a completion. So the only thing then that we're left to do is print this answer. So let's go ahead now and actually test and see if we've got the SDK working and running. I'm going to go ahead and run this program here. All right, so I am going to ask it what is a CPU for now. So far, things are working. I'll actually do one thing and remove the line from here, so we just ask in the same line. So ideally, what this is going to do is it'll use the GPT-4o API and give us a response. Fingers crossed, hope this works. By the way, in case anyone has any questions, you can keep them running in the comments or in the live chat, and I will definitely keep an eye out so that if we need to tackle any questions or so on, we can do that at the earliest. Oh, and looks like we got an answer, which is great. It is quite an extensive answer. In fairness, it mentions key components of CPU, key terms, how the CPU works. Quick note, if you can see, it's probably returning the answer in Markdown. We can actually go ahead and fine tune this answer if we want. So for that, let's actually do something cool here because we can set a system chat message which mentions that, and you know, if you've used ChatGPT or if you've used the API in the past, you know that you can actually give it a message to guide the model's behavior. So if I mention you are a helpful tech guide that explains tech terms in simple words and less than 100 words. This is going to be a guiding principle for this chat client here. So if suppose I now add a user chat message, and this is actually handy when you want to either maintain a continuous set of chat messages where you can have the assistant's responses saved as completions and a number of that. But this way you can actually emulate a full chat. Um, so if we send this in here right now, I'm going to remove. Let's actually try it once again now. So suppose I ask what is a CPU. It gives me a more controlled answer as I had asked within 100 words in simple language, which I think is great. I think it's actually quite handy. Um, Now, one thing that we want to do here is, as I mentioned, we also want to test out how image generation works with the SDK. I think that's something that's going to be pretty cool to check out as well. So what I'm going to do here right now is I'll also now initialize an image client for us. What we're going to do it in a very similar manner to the chat client, where we're going to use the OpenAI client to get an image client here. And in this case, we're going to mention the Dolly 3 model. And so what I want to do here is I want to get back an image generation which essentially creates an image of whatever completion I have just received. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the generate image prompt and I will send in the completion. By the way, you can mention the prompt here. You can actually add a few other settings if you want, which include the ratio of the image, the quality, and a number of those other things. Um, I'm not going to get into that because I am first prioritizing showcasing the exact functionality. Now, we do see a little error here, and that is that it can't convert the chat completion type into a string directly. I do have a quick little hack for that, though. We're going to use string interpolation and just add this to the string. So that's going to allow us to this is basically sending in a string and it's including whatever information we have in the completion, which we know for a fact is going to return a text here. It's just because it's a different type, as we can see. Um, it we're going to have to kind of work around that. So what I'm gonna do here is actually we'll just clear this up and then run it once again. So now what this is going to do is this is going to generate an image for us as well that we can use. So what I'll do now is I'll actually just mm, I'll add a little text generated image and we'll include the image within this because it's going to effectively return a URL to us of the image. So now that we've implemented image generation with the OpenAI SDK, we can try this out as well. And it's going to generate whatever this prompt gives us. I hope things make sense so far, by the way. So suppose right now what I ask this is, what is a keyboard? So it gives us an explanation, a description of what a keyboard is. But now instead of finishing off, it is also going to tell us, it's going to give us an image generation, which I just realized I needed to add the image URI. My bad on that. That one's on me. We will just run this once again and keyboard again, and it will give us an actual URI this time. So now we can see that it's given us this URI that we can open up. I'm going to click and open this in my browser here. And as soon as this loads, we should have an image of a keyboard, which by Dolly standards, I think this is a good depiction of what a keyboard is. Now, as I said, this of course is a demonstration of how you can use the OpenAI SDK, but I know a number of us do not use the OpenAI API directly, but actually interact with Azure's OpenAI service, which has been a really, really handy tool as well that we can use. We're done with this key for now, so I'm going to delete it. I will revoke it just so that, well, because I ended up showing it on screen, of course. But yeah, aside from the OpenAI APIs that are already available, Azure actually has an OpenAI service that we can also try out. So if you have not actually come across this in advance, The Azure OpenAI service offers the same APIs that OpenAI does, but it lets you maintain a private endpoint, um, pick which specific models you want to use and deploy those accordingly. And of course, you can build through Azure when you use this. So there are a number of benefits to using Azure OpenAI on that front. Plus, of course, you get easier integrations with other Azure offerings. Like for example, um, one way, of course, to use Azure OpenAI is with the API key. But if you also additionally want security with Microsoft Entra or Azure Active Directory, if you've known it that way, that is possible as well. So it does allow far more integrations because that's been pre-built to ensure it works well with the Azure ecosystem. The only things to keep in mind here is that you need to apply to use the Azure OpenAI service. Right now, it is available as a limited access API. So you can request to get access to this service and these models, and there is more information on how you can apply for this. Of course, when you visit the Azure OpenAI website, I already have access to this service right now. So I am going to go ahead to my Azure portal and create an instance of this particular resource right now. So as we can see, we're now on my Azure portal here. I am going to search OpenAI, which of course shows me the Azure OpenAI service. Now, I do already have an instance, which is why this is showing it here. But if you simply search OpenAI, you can also see an instance directly on the marketplace if you would prefer that. Um, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and create an OpenAI resource for us. Um, I am going to I'll create a new resource group for this as well. So I'll call it Season of AI. We'll keep the East US region because right now within Azure, different models are available on different regions. There is a list of that which you can check. So if, for example, if I just go ahead and look up regions here, you will find which models are available in which different region. All of that information is currently available within the Azure OpenAI documentation. Now, in this case, GPT-4o is available in East US, and so is Dolly 3. The reason I know is because I looked that up in advance, but as we can see, it is explicitly mentioned here. So I will create a resource of, the East US region. I will call it Season of AI. The pricing tier, there is only one option at the moment. I will keep the network access for this open at the moment. That's not exactly a problem right now. We leave the tags empty, but of course, if you have a much larger project and you need to categorize resources accordingly, that is something I recommend doing because I don't, it's not a worry for me. But yeah, with that, of course, we'll go ahead and create well, an Azure OpenAI resource for us. So once this resource is deployed, um, this is going to let us know, and so we can visit the resource and get our API key and our endpoint for this. However, the Azure OpenAI service will have a little more configuration once we're done with that. So we're just going to wait while this resource deploys here. It's going to be a quick job, doesn't take too much time in general. But while this is happening, actually what we can do is we can go ahead and install the Azure OpenAI SDK for us. So the way we do that is similar to earlier. We're going to use the .NET add package command. but we have a different package we want to use here, which is the azure.ai.openai package. And this one is also a pre-release version of the SDK that we're using for the latest version. So we're going to install a pre-release version here. Now, the cool thing about the Azure OpenAI SDK is that it actually works in conjunction with the OpenAI SDK. So what we're going to do is we're going to change our OpenAI client as to how that is initialized. But the moment we do, and yes, beyond that, we will need to change these models to the deployment names, which I will be showing how to in just a few minutes as soon as it's initialized. But aside from that, our chat completions, our image completion creation, all of that remains the same actually, which I think is really cool. Um, Either way, just to double check, we can see that we have an Azure AI resource available here as well. That is the version we were expecting. So that's all good. Now, let's go back and see if the resource deployed, which it has. So what I'm going to do here for now is first things first, I will store the endpoint as an environment variable as and well grab my API key after that. What I'll call it is Azure OAI endpoint, and the API key as well, Azure OAI key. Once that is done, the next thing we're going to do is actually comment this out. We'll create an Azure OpenAI client. For that, we use the Azure OpenAI library that we just set up. However, this is going to need more than just, well, the API key, because of course each resource has its own um, URI that you need to consume. So the first thing we do is we add a new URI. We already saved this as an environment variable. So what we called that was Azure OAI endpoint. And then of course we need to add a new key credential. The type for that is Azure key credential. That is something to keep in mind. Um, and within that, we'll use the Azure OAI key. So with that, of course, we have our Azure OpenAI client. We'll comment this out as well for now. And in this case, what we will do is we will get a chat client, but we won't be using the exact model name directly. The reason for that is when you deploy a specific model in the Azure OpenAI service, you get more configuration options. Like for example, when I go to the Azure OpenAI Studio now through our Azure portal, this is going to let me deploy versions of each model with more configurable usage limits, rate limits, things like that. So when I go ahead now, I can actually create a deployment of GPT-4o multiple times with different limits if I want, which wouldn't necessarily be possible with OpenAI's API directly, right? Like when I go ahead now and I select GPT-4o, you can select the specific model version of that. You can select the deployment type, which it does actually define. We're good with the standard for now. You can set your own name, which I will call, um, I will call it Chat Gen as of now. There are actually more options here. Like if you want a content filter, right now this only has a default filter. You can set the tokens rate limit. You can enable dynamic quota if you want to. Um, dynamically increase quota and receive higher throughput based on usage. So it gives you far more configuration options. Similarly, I will create a deployment for Dolly 3 here. I'll call this one image gen. Yeah, this has a much lower request per minute quota at the time. But yeah, with that, we've got a deployment for GPT-4o and Dolly 3. Now, when we use the Azure OpenAI client instead of the standard OpenAI client now, what we do here is that instead of the model name, we use the deployment name instead. So you could have multiple deployments of GPT-4 over different limits, and you could use different deployments for different applications if you'd like. Similarly, with the image client, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to use the Azure OpenAI client instead, and we will use our deployment, the image gen deployment for this purpose. And by saving this, the rest of our code remains the same. It'll use the same images, models. It's getting the same responses essentially. The only difference is that we're using a different client and we're using our deployments on Azure OpenAI instead of from the OpenAI API directly. So with that, I am going to go ahead and run our application. Now, this time I think we've asked it what a CPU is, we've asked it what a GPU is. We've asked what a keyboard is. Let's ask what a GPU is actually this time. So we get a description fairly quickly of what a GPU is. Um, yeah, this is a pretty handy tip, by the way. When you know you want limited answers, and if you specify limits to the API, it's going to be able to give you quicker responses. Um, but yeah, with that, of course, we have an image is generated as well, which we can take a look at now. Oof, I think that was actually a pretty cool image that it's created for us. But yeah, that's a demonstration of how you can use the OpenAI SDK and the Azure OpenAI service within your .NET applications. Now, I did this with a console app only. However, you can, of course, create an API. Um, you can have, a full Blazor application. You could effectively use this with any um, kind of .NET application that you want. By the way, just because I effectively showed my API key and stuff here, I'm going to go ahead and delete the resource. But before that, um, yeah, I'm gonna have to delete my model deployments once. Cleanup is always a good thing. That's just a good habit if you don't need resources. Otherwise, well, you are spending money to keep them up. Um, so that's one thing to keep in mind. I know these APIs are cool. It's very easy to forget where where you start spending money and where you stop doing that. So just make sure if you're not using these resources, it's just a good cloud platform habit. Please don't keep resources that you don't need. Okay, so it's deleting that resources. We were good to go on that. One thing I can do here actually, if that sounds good, is I'll publish this repository to GitHub. And what we'll do is we'll call it .NET OpenAI sample, and we'll publish to a private repository. Now we don't need the bin and the obj file. That's unnecessary. The rest we will keep here. And so this is actually publishing this little app we've got here to my GitHub account right now. So as you can see, we've got our program that we created available here with us. And if you want to pull this code and run it, um, you just need to, well, run the command .NET restore. When you clone it to your device, of course, you'll have to configure the environment variables on your own. So that is a little task. But other than that, this program is what we built and it's fully functioning as you've all seen here. So yeah, I guess that's what I had for my demo about how you can use the OpenAI library. I can actually share this repo in the private chat if we want to send it over in the comments. I can try sending it myself, but I know sometimes there are challenges on StreamYard with the non channel owner sharing links. It's a good security feature, if I'm honest. I think it's pretty neat because people do share a lot of spam links. So I've also sent it to um, the reskill team and if we want to send it forward in case it doesn't go through on YouTube. But yeah, I think that's it for my demo.
Great. Thank you so much, Aditya. It was an insightful session. I hope everyone has learned something today
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and use it.
I hope so as well. I think I'm actually really fond of Azure, Azure and OpenAI's tooling in general. It's actually quite handy. I do use OpenAI a lot for a few of my own uh, work and projects. Like I do use it a good bit with I do use Dolly actually a good bit. That's probably what I use the most. And I know there are a number of places where I use it a lot for summarization of information. So it's a pretty handy tool, and you know this way
Yeah,
you can have your own little application that you can use whenever you want. So I know there have been scenarios where ChatGPT has had outages, but the API keys work perfectly. So I've actually used my own versions of the chatbot when I needed them to.
that's nice. So I'll just end the stream.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good. And yeah, just one thing, I guess if anyone has